Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
My mother slid a porcelain cup across the table on the evening of my birthday, the steam curling upward in delicate ribbons, and with the most carefully practiced smile she could summon, she said it was her way of apologizing. Her exact words were, "Let's just start fresh, honey. It's your special day," as though all the years of bruises she left on my pride, all the times she chose my sister's needs over mine, could dissolve into the hot amber liquid sitting in front of me. I thanked her anyway, because politeness has been stitched into me like an ugly patch on a dress I never wanted to wear, but instead of lifting the cup to my lips, I slowly pushed it toward my sister Emily, who had been flown home like royalty from Paris for the occasion. Emily accepted it with a smirk, the kind she had always used when she knew I was the second choice. She raised it to her mouth with no hesitation, and moments later, her breath hitched. The smirk faltered, her eyes widened, and the sound of her chair scraping against the hardwood filled the dining room as she clutched at her throat. My mother's gaze snapped to mine, not in confusion but in something darker, like accusation mixed with fear, and while Emily sputtered, I calmly reached for my water glass and took a long, deliberate sip. That is how the night began, but to understand the weight of that moment, you need to know the kind of home I grew up in, the kind where love was rationed like wartime sugar, measured out in spoonfuls that somehow always landed in my sister's cup instead of mine. Emily was born 3 years after me, and from the moment she entered the world, my mother treated her as though she had been carved out of marble by God himself, flawless and precious, while I was just practice. I was the daughter expected to be understanding, the one who had to learn early that being overlooked was not a mistake, but a family policy. Emily got ballet classes, piano lessons, and later, French tutors that eventually justified sending her across the ocean to Paris. I got the advice to save your money, be practical, don't waste it on dreams. The cruelest part was not that Emily was sent away, but that my mother always acted as though it were the most natural decision in the world, as if the family budget somehow stretched like elastic for her but snapped tight for me. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, holding a scholarship letter I had received for a summer writing program in Chicago. I was 16, trembling with excitement, thinking maybe this was finally my chance to prove I was worth investing in. My mother glanced at the letter, then folded it neatly, slid it back to me, and said, "That's nice, sweetheart, but flights and hotels aren't cheap. You'll understand when you're older." She used that same tone she reserved for brushing lint off her coat, dismissive, impatient, certain it didn't belong there. A week later, I overheard her bragging to a neighbor about Emily's ballet recital costume, which had cost more than the Chicago trip would have. Years of those small moments piled up like bricks in a wall between us, until I could hardly see her face through the resentment. It wasn't just jealousy, though I admit there was plenty of that. It was the suffocating sense of being invisible while still standing in plain sight. Even when I achieved something undeniable, she managed to fold it into a shadow beneath Emily's glow. When I graduated college with honors, my mother congratulated me with a quick hug, but spent the entire dinner telling relatives how Emily was thriving in France, how cultured she was, how she was finding herself. When I bought my first used car with my own money, my mother said, "Good, now you can drive your sister to the airport." So when she placed that cup of tea in front of me on my birthday, the gesture rang hollow, like an echo in a canyon. It wasn't just tea. It was every forced apology she had ever offered in my life, every pat on the head that came with a backhanded comparison. And as Emily reached for it, I realized something unsettling. I didn't stop her. I didn't even hesitate. The dining room that evening was dressed up as though it belonged to a family who cherished one another. There was a white tablecloth, a vase of roses, candles flickering low. My mother had prepared my favorite dish, or at least she claimed it was, though I suspected it was chosen more for presentation than memory. My father sat quietly, as always, the silent referee who never blew the whistle, letting the game play out no matter how dirty it got. Emily had returned from Paris with stories, gifts, and that radiant sense of importance that clung to her like expensive perfume. She wore a dress that probably cost more than my entire paycheck from the office job I had been grinding away at. I came straight from work in a simple blouse and skirt, my shoes still scuffed from the commute. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone, least of all me. I felt like the backdrop to a scene I wasn't meant to star in. And maybe that's why I did it, why I pushed the cup toward her with a casual hand, as if I were simply being generous. I watched her raise it to her lips, and for once, she didn't look like the untouchable darling. She looked ordinary, vulnerable, human. When she began to choke, the room fractured. My father leapt up, knocking his chair over, stammering incoherently as though words might save her. My mother froze, her fingers pressed to her lips, her eyes boring into me. She didn't look at Emily, not even once, and that detail lodged itself into my brain like a splinter. Why was she staring at me instead of helping her perfect daughter? What did she expect to see in my face? Guilt? Satisfaction? Or recognition? Emily's coughing eased eventually, the crisis dissipating into awkward silence, but the air in that room had changed forever. My mother's stare didn't. It clung to me, sharp and suspicious, as though we both understood something unspoken had just shifted. And as I set my empty glass of water back down on the table, I knew this birthday would not be remembered for cake or candles, but for the moment when everything between us, between me, my sister, and the woman who raised us, finally cracked. When the room finally quieted after the coughing fit and the chairs were set upright and the roses stopped trembling in the candle draft, I excused myself to the hallway under the flimsy pretense of needing the restroom. Because what I actually needed was space to feel the way my chest was knocking against my ribs and to decide whether I was going to let the moment slide into the same old family script or whether I was going to start writing a new one where I wasn't the afterthought with. The practical shoes and the polite laugh, one where I didn't pretend not to notice my mother's eyes tracking me as though the answer to a question she didn't want to say out loud was printed somewhere on my skin. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and something floral that never grew in our yard, and as I stood in the hallway looking at the framed photographs my mother curated the same way realtors stage open houses, I realized she had built a museum to Emily out of ordinary moments and travel. Passes and glossy graduation portraits, while my presence lived in the edges of frames, in the reflections on the glass, in the rooms where I took the photos, but didn't belong on the wall. Emily had been the golden child not just in private but publicly, in the kind of way that keeps PDA moms nodding with admiration and neighbors offering casseroles for the busy weeks before Paris, even though the busy weeks were mine, not hers. Because I was the one working weekends, covering shifts, paying down college loans with the grim determination of someone who knows the interest is not a suggestion, and all the while my mother narrated our family life like a pageant, always landing on the same punchline. Emily's opportunities were proof of her brilliance, while my responsibilities were proof of my maturity. A neat way of telling the world that if you looked closely enough you would see fairness, that our family didn't play favorites, that some of us were simply built for the kind of light that gets you noticed. If I sound bitter, it is because I learned the taste slowly, the way you grow accustomed to too strong coffee because you can't afford the fancy beans, and by the time you can, you've already convinced yourself that bitterness is part of being awake. There were the birthday parties where the Costco sheet cake had my name in frosting, but the conversation kept pivoting to Emily's additions, and the holidays where I arrived early to cook while Emily arrived late to applause, and the long winter. When I drove Mom to her appointments because Dad hates city traffic, only to have her tell the receptionist, "My younger daughter is helping me this week. The other one lives such an exciting life in Europe." As if I were a temporary volunteer and not the person who remembered which pills made her dizzy. It would have been easier if Emily had been cruel, because then I could have sharpened myself against her and felt righteous about the sparks, but she was friendly in the way people are when they've never been told no. Offering me little souvenirs from places I couldn't afford to go, draping an arm over my shoulder for photos that would live on her stories with cheerful captions about family. And I would smile because I didn't want to be the sister who ruined Thanksgiving by choosing reality over softness. Still, even her kindness had a weight, the kind that flattens you like a heavy blanket, smothering you with a comfort you didn't ask for. I used to keep a box under my bed with the receipts of moments that hurt, Not literal receipts, but scraps of paper, program stubs, notes to myself so I wouldn't gaslight my own memory when Mom insisted I was too sensitive. There was the summer writing program brochure with the scholarship letter stapled to it, the one she folded and slid back to me with the phrase, "Be practical," and there was a photo from a July cookout where I stood behind the grill while Emily took a bow for her newest internship news, and there was a yellow sticky note with a shopping list in Mom's handwriting, one that had T for peace scrawled next to dish soap and paper towels, a little joke she made when we'd argued about the Paris rent fund and she'd apologized by brewing a special pot that left me nauseated the entire afternoon, though at the time I called it stress and moved on because it was easier to blame my own stomach than examine what was steeping in the kitchen. The night of my birthday, after Emily's throat calmed and Dad insisted she must have swallowed wrong and Mom insisted nothing was wrong at all, I stood in that hallway and I thought about how narratives get built, how the person who sends the group text first sets the tone, and how families like ours prefer a comfortable lie over an inconvenient truth. So I pulled out my phone and took a photo of an old picture on the wall, the Halloween when Mom forgot to pick me up from practice because she was driving Emily to an audition, the one where I am still wearing shin guards under a witch costume because I had to run straight from the field to the neighborhood parade. And I typed a caption for the family chat that sounded light and nostalgic, but carried a little knife tucked behind the ribbon, something like, "Found this throwback where I learned multitasking while Em learned stage presence." Mom always said it built character for me and confidence for her. Funny how that works, and I hit send, knowing the aunts and cousins and the two uncles who think they're therapists would react with laughing emojis and then with those hesitant dots that mean someone is going to say, "Hold on, though," and then the quiet questions would start. The kind that don't go away after the thread dies, and that was my small revenge for the evening, not because it was dramatic, but because it put a crack in the museum glass. The replies popped one after another, Aunt Lisa asking if I remembered how she once drove me home when Mom was stuck, a cousin admitting she always wondered why I wasn't in more photos, my father sending a thumbs up he probably thought was neutral but read like an admission that he had seen what we all pretended wasn't there, and while the chorus buzzed, I slipped into the kitchen to refill my water, because once you start telling the truth, even sideways, you need something to cool your mouth. And there, next to the sink where the teapot still breathed in little fogs, I saw the grocery bag half tucked into the trash, its top folded but not pressed down, and a receipt peeking out like a tongue, so I pulled it free without thinking. Because curiosity is a muscle that flexes before judgment can clamp down, and I read the list of items my mother had bought that afternoon, all ordinary things we always needed: milk, lemons, honey, napkins, until my eye stopped on the final line. A tiny indulgence that wasn't on any of our usual lists, a bottle of bitter almond extract from the specialty aisle, the kind bakers love and people with certain sensitivities do not, and I felt the floor tilt just a fraction, like the house had exhaled. Because either it meant nothing at all or it meant more than I was ready to admit. I slid the receipt back where I found it and returned to the table with my face arranged into nothing in particular, the way you look at a neighbor in the elevator, not warm and not cold, just present. And I sat down and asked Emily about Paris and laughed at her jokes and nodded when Dad complained about traffic on the bridge, and I kept my hands wrapped around the chilled water glass like it could anchor me to the version of myself who never pushed cups across tables, while my phone on the chair beside me buzzed with the quieter second wave of family messages. "Are you okay? Do you want to talk? Did something happen tonight?" And when Mom finally leaned close and whispered in a voice she must have thought sounded maternal and not frantic, "What exactly are you trying to do?" I smiled the same smile I use when I sign for packages that aren't mine and said, "Just sharing memories." Knowing full well that the next thing to happen would not be shared, it would be dragged into the light whether she liked it or not, because secrets smell stronger after you've broken the jar, and the jar tonight had a label I couldn't ignore. Dessert arrived the way it always did in our house when Mom wanted to underline the script that said we were perfectly fine, a glossy pie that looked like a magazine page and a little silver pitcher of cream set in the center as if dairy could negotiate a ceasefire. And while Dad fetched forks and Emily reapplied her lip balm with the concentration of a surgeon preparing for a delicate stitch, I slid my water glass in a slow circle on the table and thought about the receipt folded inside that grocery bag and about how many years I had been told to stop overthinking, to let things go, to keep the peace because family is family and mothers try their best. And I decided I was done being the quiet older sister who allows the room to reset to neutral after every minor earthquake. So I stood up and said, with a smile that wasn't sugary or mean but steady, that I wanted to make a birthday toast. Nothing dramatic. Just a short memory game where we each shared one moment from our past that we would happily repeat and one moment we would happily rewrite, because if birthdays mean anything for adults, it's the right to call time on the narrative and pick which scenes we carry forward. They humored me because they always do when I cloak honesty in a party hat, so Dad offered something safe about a beach trip when we were little and Mom, who loves being the director, praised the beach trip choice and added a monologue about Emily's fearless first jumps off the dock and my nurturing spirit in making sure sunscreen was applied, as if my childhood job had been moisturization. And then it was Emily's turn and she leaned back in her chair and tilted her head with that half smile that once charmed a scholarship committee, and she said that she would happily repeat the Christmas when she surprised Mom with the ballet tickets, and she would rewrite the year she almost missed a connection at the airport because someone, meaning me, borrowed her carry-on and didn't put the luggage tag back, which drew a polite round of laughter, and I nodded because we are all allowed our selective memory. Then I cleared my throat and said I would happily repeat the morning Aunt Lisa taught me how to change a tire in a church parking lot because it made me believe I could survive without being rescued, and I would rewrite the afternoon when Mom told me to be practical and folded my scholarship letter like a napkin. And I let the sentence sit there long enough to ripen, then added lightly that I would also rewrite the recipe for tea for peace, because bitter almond is great in a cookie if everyone knows it's there, but less great when someone is allergic, even mildly, and less great still when nobody expects the flavor to show up in a cup. Silence did not fall so much as gather, the way summer humidity gathers before a storm, sticky and inevitable, and my mother, who had been cutting the pie with the precision of a jeweler, paused with the knife in the air and said she didn't know what I meant, her tone landing on the careful syllables people use when they have rehearsed a denial without knowing the exact accusation, while my father glanced between us, as if we were two cars approaching the same intersection without brakes, and Emily, who has never enjoyed being left out of a plot twist, set down her lip balm and said that almond is common and that Paris taught her to appreciate nuanced flavors, and that perhaps I should try adventurous baking before making insinuations. Which would have been cute if her throat hadn't reddened again as she spoke, a faint irritation blooming just above her collarbone that she masked with a laugh and a sip of water. I kept my eyes on my mother because she was the real audience, and I said in a conversational voice that I had cleaned the kitchen before, lots of times, and that I knew where the spices usually lived and where the tea usually lived and how, if someone introduced a new bottle from a specialty aisle, they might forget to tuck the receipt all the way down into the bag, especially if they were distracted by planning a perfect dinner, and I let the words flow without raising them into accusation. Because sometimes it is kinder to hand people their own footprints and ask whether those are the shoes they meant to wear, and in the corner of my vision I saw Dad's hand hover over the napkins like he wished paper could sop up tension the way it sops up spilled cream. The small revenge I had planned was not a siren or a police report or anything that would turn our dining room into an episode of a show where the neighbors whisper on their porches. It was simpler and, in its own way, meaner. Because it asked Mom to feel visible in the way I had felt invisible for so many years. I took the little gift bag that had been waiting by my chair, a bag I had labeled for Emily with a pretty ribbon and a note that said, "For your Paris kitchen. When you finally invite me to see the famous view from your window," a note that made everyone chuckle when I handed it to her, and I asked her to open it now, please, because I wanted my birthday wish to be a shared future where we actually know what each of us is cooking with, and Emily, always game for a reveal, pulled apart the tissue paper and lifted out a small glass bottle with a tidy label and a delicate cap, a brand new vial of plain vanilla extract with a bow around its neck, and then beneath it, another bottle. This one a twin to the bitter almond extract my mother thought she had hidden under grocery trash, and Emily stopped smiling in a way that made the room tilt, because she is smart and she does not like feeling foolish. And Mom's knife tapped the plate twice like a metronome that had lost the beat. I said, still gentle, still almost joking, that gift 1 was for joy and gift 2 was for honesty, and that I had taped the receipt to the bottom because Paris might not honor our local returns and because transparency is cheaper than plane tickets. And I turned the bottle just enough for my mother to see the store name and the timestamp, which aligned neatly with the hour she texted me earlier. The chipper message that said she had everything under control and I shouldn't bring anything but my appetite. Dad closed his eyes, a small prayer or a small retreat, and Emily, stubborn in her pride, but not reckless with her body, pushed the pie away with 2 fingers and said she had lost her sweet tooth. Then asked if anyone else tasted something odd in the tea earlier or if she was being dramatic, and Mom, cornered by the softness of the question and the hardness of the evidence, did not confess, which I had predicted. But she did something better for my purposes. She laughed too loudly and said the word ridiculous twice in a row, a verbal tic she only deploys when she is terrified, and that laugh went out into the house like a flare, illuminating everything we all preferred to keep dim. My phone buzzed on the chair with a text from Aunt Lisa, who has an uncanny sense for tremors, and the preview line said only, "Call me when you can. I should have told you years ago about the time your mother," which made my scalp prickle. Because if there is one thing I know about family history, it is that the omitted sentence is always the real one, and I tucked the phone under my thigh and told Mom I was thinking of starting a new birthday tradition next year, one where we rotate locations and menus and histories, and Mom said, too quickly, that she loves traditions just the way they are, and I said, smiling the polite smile I have used at 1,000 office meetings, that I know she does, but I also know she will adjust. Because I am done drinking what I didn't order and done pretending it tastes like forgiveness, and as I lifted my water again, a simple glass, clear and cold, no fragrance, no surprise, Aunt Lisa's name lit up my screen with a second message that read, "Actually, don't wait. Pick up now. It's about the year you got sick after that peace tea, and you need to hear this before you go home." And I pressed accept while watching my mother's face, which told me more than any recipe card ever could. I answered Aunt Lisa's call with the casualness of someone stepping into the laundry room to check whether the dryer had finally stopped chewing towels, except I didn't leave the table and I didn't lower my voice. Because there are moments when secrecy feels like complicity, and I have done enough of that for a lifetime, so I pressed the speaker button under the pretext of keeping my hands free for pie I had no intention of touching. And I said hello in a tone that invited company, not privacy. Which was the first sign to everyone, especially my mother, that whatever lived in Aunt Lisa's throat was about to live in our dining room, too. My aunt, who has always been braver by phone than in person because honesty seems to travel better across electricity than across a living room rug, began with the soft cliches, how she loved me, how families are complicated, how she never meant to be the keeper of stories that weren't hers, and I told her, still smiling, still drinking only water, that I was too old for vague comfort and too young to keep swallowing it, and that if she had a memory with my name on it, she should take a deep breath and hand it over. She did exactly that, and the air shifted again as she described a spring in high school that I remember in flashes of exhaustion and anxiety, the one before the big tests and the scholarship interviews. The one when Mom and I fought over money and choices, and whose future needed sacrifices, and after a particularly cruel argument, hers cruel, mine honest, but clumsy, Mom brewed what she called peace tea, and brought it to my room with a speech about starting fresh, and she watched me drink it. While she smoothed my hair like I was 7 and had scraped a knee, later that afternoon, I got tunnel vision and a pounding headache and the kind of nausea that makes time unlatch from its hinges, and Mom two-dayed about nerves and insisted I sleep it off, and Aunt Lisa, who had stopped by to drop off church flyers, found me half cold on top of the sheets and insisted we go to urgent care, and then, in the parking lot, she lifted the to-go cup that Mom had packed for me, took one whiff, and frowned. In a way she never told me about until now. I asked her, without moving my eyes from my mother, what she had smelled, and Aunt Lisa took another breath and said it was the same thing she smelled tonight when she hugged my mother at the door. Not strong enough to set off alarms. Just a whisper of bitter almond under the mint, and she said she didn't say anything back then because the doctor called it a stress reaction and the fluids helped, and Mom cried in the exam room about how hard it was to raise a brilliant, anxious daughter, and the narrative wrapped around all of us like a bandage that hides infection because it looks tidy from the outside. Emily made a dismissive sound that she probably thought landed like sophistication and not evasion, and she announced that bitter almond is practically a mood in Paris and that lots of mothers bake with it and nobody dies in opera houses over a cookie. And Dad murmured her name as a warning because even he could feel the gap between pastry and pattern, between flavor and purpose. My mother tried the reasonable voice next, the one she uses with delivery people who ring twice, saying almond extract is a pantry staple and we are becoming hysterical, and that if anyone had been truly in danger, urgent care would have said so, and that she would never harm her daughters, and that she had simply wanted a nice evening for my birthday, and that all this insinuating fruitiness was beneath us, and she almost had me because I know the lore of neat explanations and because I spent half my life wanting to believe my mother would choose me. But Aunt Lisa had not finished, and she said, gently but with a backbone, that she had asked the urgent care doctor, purely out of caution, about household irritants that can worsen mild sensitivities, especially when mixed with common over-the-counter tablets, and that the doctor had said something banal about reading labels, and that later, while Mom went to pick up a prescription that I do not remember ever taking, Aunt Lisa had rinsed my to-go cup, and the sink carried a faint glossy slick that made her think of flavorings, and she had promised herself she would speak up if she ever smelled that combination again, except she never did. Because guilt is complicated and love is louder until it isn't. I thanked her steadily and ended the call with a promise to talk later in private about the things we both wish we had known earlier. Then I set my phone down on the table like a gavel without banging it. And I told my mother that I was done debating palettes and memories, that what mattered to me was pattern and power, and that tonight I had no interest in calling anyone a monster, only in declining to be cast as a fool. She said I was dramatic, and I said yes, but no longer obedient, which is more dangerous in this family than any drama, and then I performed the small revenge I had been saving for exactly the moment when denial met oxygen. I opened the family group chat that had been chuckling over my memory game an hour earlier, and I dropped 3 items in quick succession: the photo of the receipt with the timestamp circled, a screenshot of my urgent care bill from that high school spring which I had pulled from the insurance portal last week when nostalgia sent me rummaging for old paperwork, and a picture I took in her kitchen 10 minutes ago of the specialty bottle peeking from beneath the grocery bag, the label half hidden, but not enough to save anyone from their own handwriting on the shopping list. The room hummed with the polite chime of phones receiving a truth they had not asked for, and the group responses began to blink into existence. Aunt Lisa's "call me a cousin Zoe," and my father's long, unpunctuated "we should talk" that read like a man realizing he has been living inside a story somebody else wrote. And Emily went pale in a way that had nothing to do with allergies and everything to do with losing the moral high ground she thought Paris had deeded to her, and Mom stared at me with eyes that said, "If you loved me you would stop right now," and I stared back with a face that said, "If you had loved me like a daughter and not like a prop, we would not be here." I told her, evenly, that we were going to make 2 changes starting tonight, and I watched her mouth tense because she hates the word change unless she controls it, and I said first that every shared meal from now on would be potluck and photographed, which I presented as a cheerful, modern solution for a family that loves to document its life, and second, that I would be taking home the spare house key she once insisted I keep for emergencies, not because I plan to use it but because boundaries have a weight you can feel in your purse, and she opened her mouth to protest and then closed it because even she knew the room would not support her, and I slid the key into my bag with the clean click of a new habit beginning, and then I turned to Emily and said, with more kindness than she deserved, but perhaps exactly the amount I could bear, that I had ordered an allergen testing appointment for the 2 of us next week and sent her the confirmation while we sat there, which meant That? If she needed a medically neutral villain, she could pick a lab, not a sister. My mother whispered, almost inaudibly, that I was tearing the family apart, and I answered, not softly and not loud, that I was refusing to hold it together with lies, and the silence that followed spread its wings until even the candles seemed to burn slower. And then the doorbell rang, a plain suburban sound that somehow felt like a plot point arriving right on cue, and my father pushed back his chair with the carefulness of someone creeping across thin ice, and when he opened the door and stepped aside, Aunt Lisa walked in with a manila envelope pressed flat against her chest like a prayer book, and she said, in the kind of voice that changes evenings into consequences, that she found the thing she should have given me years ago. The thing Mom asked her to keep for the sake of peace, and as she held it out to me, my mother said my name in a small voice I had never heard, and I took the envelope knowing that whatever it contained would either absolve us or finish us, and that, either way, I was going to read every word. The manila envelope felt heavier than paper has any right to feel, the sort of weight that isn't measured in ounces, but in the years you have to drag behind you after you read what's inside. And when I slid a finger under the seal and lifted the flap, I found exactly the kind of archive a careful sister-in-law builds when she is trying to honor both truth and the peace she was begged to preserve. A stack of photocopied notes in my mother's looping handwriting labeled with sweet names that would look innocent in any suburban kitchen drawer: Sunday Calm, Peace Night, Reset Blend, with lists of ingredients that could have been clipped from a wholesome magazine: mint and chamomile and lemon peel, and, threaded like a thin wire through the middle, bitter almond extract in quantities that were not outrageous, but were precise enough to suggest she had measured more than flavor, and tucked between the recipe cards were 2 emails printed from an account she never uses anymore, one to Aunt Lisa and one to her book club friend, both sent in that final year of high school when my body kept rebelling at inconvenient hours, and both written in the same kindly managerial tone my mother deploys when she wants the room to admire her efforts, asking whether almond can take the edge off a sensitive stomach when she is too worked up to eat, and whether it is fine in small amounts with common over-the-counter tablets, questions that a reasonable person could read as anxious caretaking, if they were inclined to give Dowd an extra blanket and a warm bed, and which, lined up with the receipts and the way she watched me drink, looked to me like someone studying not just the recipe for calm, but the recipe for control. I handed the pages to Emily first, because I wanted her to understand that the pedestal she stood on was not marble but corkboard, push-pinned together with all the ways Mom managed us. And to my surprise, she read every line without the defensive smirk she wears like lip color, and when she reached the end, she did not fling the papers back at me or accuse me of dramatics. She asked, in a voice that made her sound like the younger sister she is rather than the crowned traveler she likes to play, whether I truly believed Mom meant harm or whether she simply wanted quiet, and I told her the most honest answer I had, that I believed Mom wanted outcomes and had stopped noticing the costs as long as the house stayed photo-ready, and that some people think harm only counts if it lands you in a hospital with a diagnosis code, while others know harm can be a series of small storms timed to wash you back to the dock. My father took the envelope next and sat with it for a span of time that stretched until even the candles seemed to resent their own light, and when he finally lifted his eyes, he did not defend my mother or minimize Aunt Lisa's caution. He simply said softly, carefully, like a man practicing a new muscle, that we were going to change the rules in this house, that apologies would be spoken and not brewed, that ingredients would be labeled and not whispered, and that if anyone preferred the old way, they were free to decline invitations, and in that moment I felt a strange, unexpected pity for my mother, because nothing scares a director like an audience that has learned to look for the camera. For my last revenge, the one I promised myself I would save for the final act when ambiguity had to coexist with accountability, I asked for a family brunch the following Sunday and volunteered to host. Not as a trap, but as a stage where everyone would see that consequences can be elegant. So I set out a table where every jar and bottle wore a clear label in my handwriting, where pitchers of water stood with lids and tags describing nothing more mysterious than temperature, where the Centerpiece was a plain bowl of lemons and a stack of sealed tea bags in their original packaging, and when Mom arrived with a pie and the familiar brightness she uses as armor, I welcomed her warmly, thanked her for the dessert, and handed her a card that read, in neat script, "House policy. You are loved here, but the kitchen is closed to improvisation," a line that would be cruel if you didn't know what improvisation has cost me, and kind if you did, and she smiled, brittle and brave, and said she understood, and then reached for a sealed bag like everyone else and placed it carefully into her cup as if she were learning how to be a guest. At the table I told a story, not the whole archive and not the ugliest moments, just one that a balanced audience could hold without choking on it, about the year I learned that good boundaries make more room for warmth. And I ended it with a small joke about how my water glass has become my favorite piece of jewelry because it goes with everything and never lies about what it is, and the laugh that followed was real enough to loosen something in my shoulders. And when Emily lifted her cup, she met my gaze and asked, without Paris in her voice, whether I had known on my birthday, whether I pushed the tea to her like a test or a dare or an act of mercy, and I told her the truth that will keep people arguing in the comments under any video of this night. That I did not know anything I could have proven, that I returned the apology to its favorite audience because I was tired of swallowing explanations that tasted like someone else's comfort, and that I drank my water because I wanted to. Know who my mother looked at when a plan bent the wrong direction. I do not know if my mother intended harm the way a villain in a courtroom drama intends it, measuring drops like a chemist and twirling an invisible mustache, and I do not plan to decide for her. Because deciding has been my unpaid job since childhood and I am on strike, yet I know what I saw in her face when Emily's throat tightened and in her handwriting where Almond sits like a quiet guest at every apology. And I know how quickly she laughed the word ridiculous when confronted with evidence, and how she has not poured tea for me since, and how she texts Aunt Lisa more gently now, and how she asks, before any dinner, who is bringing what, and whether the label should say anything else. We do birthdays differently, which is to say we do them at all, and while I will never drink a cup my mother prepares with her back turned, I also do not need to stand between her and my sister like a bouncer at a velvet rope. Because the club we go to now has windows and the lights are up, and if there is a shadow moving in the corner, everyone can see it, and the seeing changes everything. Some nights I miss the sweetness of believing your family is the place where nobody would ever hand you something that makes your body forget how to be brave, and then I hold my glass and remember that water is not dramatic, but it keeps you alive, and I take a sip and let the room arrange itself around the new rules, and if my mother watches me as I drink, if she searches my face for absolution or accusation, I do not offer either. I offer only the quiet that comes from not playing along, and the story ends, for now, with my sister laughing too loudly at a joke, my father reaching for the bowl of lemons like he has always known what to do with them, and my mother setting her cup down untouched, as if she is waiting for someone to tell her it is safe, as if safety were a flavor she could learn to recognize. As if the apology she wanted to brew could finally be spoken aloud.